police had a confession. They had a conviction. They had a young man sentenced to life for a brutal murder. The case was closed. Justice, everyone believed, had been done. There was just one problem. The man who confessed was innocent. His DNA had never matched a single piece of evidence. Not once, not ever. And while he sat in a cell for a crime he didn't commit, the real killer remained exactly where he'd always been. Free, living a quiet, ordinary life directly across the street from the victim's family. In the summer of 1996, 18-year-old Angie Dodge was murdered in her own apartment in Idaho Falls. She had just moved in, her first place, the start of her adult life. The pressure to solve it was enormous, and it landed on a 20-year-old named Christopher Tapp. He told police again and again that he knew nothing. So they brought him back and back, hours of interrogation, polygraphs, telling him he'd failed, wearing him down until, exhausted and frightened, he confessed to a murder he did not commit. With no physical evidence tying him to the scene, he was convicted and sent away. Before we get into it, tell us where you're watching from, and if cases like this matter to you, subscribe. This is exactly the kind of story we tell here. It would take 23 years to undo. It would take a mother who once demanded the death penalty for that young man, then spent a decade fighting to free him. And it would take a science that did not exist in 1996, one that would catch the real killer hiding in plain sight, and become the first of its kind ever used to prove an innocent man innocent. This is the story of two men. One lost 20 years for a crime he didn't do. The other kept those same 20 years, raising a family, a few steps from the home of the girl he killed. Angie Dodge was 18 years old, and she was just beginning her life. She had recently moved into her own apartment in Idaho Falls, a small second-floor place, the first one that was truly hers. For a young woman of 18, that apartment was independence. It was the start of adulthood, of being out on her own, of figuring out who she was going to be. She had a job, she had friends, she had a mother, Carol, who loved her fiercely, and a family that was woven tightly around her. Idaho Falls in the mid-90s was a mid-sized city in the high desert of eastern Idaho, the Snake River running through it. It was the kind of place where young people gathered along the river trails on warm evenings, a loose, sprawling crowd of teenagers and 20-somethings who called themselves, half-jokingly, the River Rats. Angie was part of that world. So were the people who would, through no fault of hers, become tangled in what happened next. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She had a whole future in front of her, the ordinary, precious future of an 18-year-old who has just gotten the keys to her first apartment. That is who she was before the morning of June 13, 1996. That is the person at the center of this story, and the one too easily lost in everything that came after. Because what came after would consume 2 more decades, 2 more families, and very nearly bury the truth for good. On the morning of June 13, 1996, Angie Dodge did not show up for work. For someone reliable, an unexplained absence is its own kind of alarm. When she couldn't be reached, the worry grew, and eventually someone went to her apartment to check on her. Inside, they found her. Angie had been attacked in her own home. She had been sexually assaulted, and she had been killed with a knife, the violence so severe that it shocked even seasoned investigators. The details, out of respect for her and for her family, are not something we'll dwell on. What matters is this: it was brutal, it was personal, and it was the work of someone who had gotten into her apartment and overpowered her. But the killer left something behind. At the scene, investigators recovered biological evidence, a semen sample. In 1996, that evidence could be tested for blood type and early DNA markers, and as the technology matured, it would become the single most important thing in the entire case. It was the killer's own genetic signature, sitting in an evidence locker, waiting. Idaho Falls was stunned. This was not a city accustomed to this kind of crime. A young woman, alone in her first apartment, murdered in the night. The pressure on police to find who did it was immediate and enormous. The community wanted an answer. They wanted someone caught. They wanted to feel safe again. That pressure, the need for a fast answer to an unbearable crime, is where this case began to go wrong. For months after the murder, the case did not break. Summer turned to fall, and Idaho Falls police had no arrest. Then, in January of 1997, something happened more than 400 miles away. A man from Idaho Falls named Benjamin Hobbs was arrested in Nevada and charged with a sexual assault. When investigators back in Idaho Falls heard about it, they took a hard look at Hobbs in connection with Angie's murder, and they began doing what investigators do. They started interviewing the people in his circle, looking to build a case. One of the people in that circle was a 20-year-old named Christopher Tapp. Tapp was part of the same Loose River Rats crowd. He knew Angie. He had been seen with her at a gathering the night before she died. By every account, he was a sweet, somewhat troubled young man, a little adrift, the kind of 20-year-old still trying to find his footing. When police came asking questions, Tapp told them the truth as he knew it. He didn't know anything about who killed Angie. It should have ended there. The physical evidence, the killer's DNA, could be compared to any suspect. Tapp's did not match. Hobbs's did not match. By the cold logic of the evidence, neither of these men was the source of what was recovered from the scene. But the investigation did not follow the evidence. It followed a theory. And to make the theory work, it needed Christopher Tapp to say things that weren't true. What happened to Christopher Tapp over the following weeks is now studied as a textbook example of how a false confession is manufactured. Tapp was brought in again and again, interrogated across multiple sessions, subjected to hours upon hours of questioning, and put through polygraph tests. He was 20 years old, without a lawyer present for much of it, exhausted, frightened, and being told that he had failed lie detector tests and that cooperating was the only way out. Slowly, under that pressure, his story changed. He stopped saying he knew nothing. He began telling police a version of events that placed him at the scene and implicated others. First one friend, then a theory of a third attacker. The account shifted as the interrogation pushed it, bending toward whatever the detectives seemed to be looking for. Years later, experts who reviewed the recordings would be blunt about what they saw. One of the nation's leading authorities on false confessions, after watching the tapes, called it the worst example of police contamination and fact-feeding he had ever seen, meaning the crucial details in Tapp's confession hadn't come from Tapp at all. They appeared to have been supplied to him, then repeated back, giving the false statement the ring of authenticity. And through all of it, the one piece of hard evidence never moved. The DNA from the scene did not match Christopher Tapp. There was no forensic trace of him in that apartment. No fingerprints, no hair, no fluids. Nothing physical tied him to the crime. It didn't matter. In 1998, on the strength of his own coerced words, Christopher Tapp was convicted of the rape and murder of Angie Dodge and sentenced to decades in prison. The community got its answer. The case was officially solved. It would stay solved and wrong for the next 20 years. To understand how this case was finally broken, you have to understand one person above all others: Carol Dodge, Angie's mother. In the beginning, Carol believed what she was told. She believed the police had caught one of the people responsible for murdering her daughter. In her grief and her rage, she wanted the maximum punishment. She pushed for the death penalty for Christopher Tapp. From where she stood, he was one of the monsters who had taken her child. But the years passed, and something gnawed at her. No other attackers were ever caught. Even though the case theory had always involved more than one person, the DNA never matched anyone who'd been charged. The story never quite closed. And Carol, a grieving mother, not an investigator, did something extraordinary. She went back to the evidence herself. She obtained the recordings of Tapp's interrogations and confessions, and she watched them. And what she saw horrified her. She watched a frightened young man being led, pressured, and fed information. She watched, in one moment that stayed with her, investigators appear to show Tapp crime scene details he clearly didn't know. The more she watched, the more certain she became of something almost impossible for a victim's mother to accept: that the young man she had wanted executed for killing her daughter was very likely innocent. Most people would have stopped there. Carol did the opposite. She tracked down one of the country's foremost experts on false confessions and asked him to review the tapes. She helped pull in the Innocence Project. She became, in the words of one journalist who covered the case for years, among the most determined and courageous people he had ever met. A mother fighting not only to find the man who really killed her daughter, but to free the man wrongly imprisoned for it. She was fighting on two fronts at once, and she would need both a breakthrough in the law and a breakthrough in science to win either. While Tapp sat in prison, investigators never entirely stopped working the one thing that could actually identify the killer, that DNA sample from the scene. And in 2014, they thought they had something. Using an early form of genetic searching, looking for partial matches through a man's Y chromosome, the part passed down the male line. A database search pointed toward a filmmaker from New Orleans named Michael Usry Jr. His father had years earlier submitted DNA to a genealogy project, and that distant familial connection lit up the search. For a moment, Usry became a suspect in a decades-old Idaho murder he had nothing to do with. Investigators looked hard at him, but when his actual DNA was compared directly to the crime scene sample, it did not match. He was not the killer. The lead collapsed, and the charges and suspicion against him fell away. It was a false alarm, but it was also a preview. It showed that the answer to this case was hiding inside the killer's own family tree, in the DNA of relatives who had no idea their genes might one day point investigators toward a murderer. The 2014 attempt used the wrong tool and grabbed the wrong man. But the underlying idea, find the family, then find the individual, was about to become the most powerful cold case technique in the world. The science just had to catch up, and while it did, a separate fight was finally about to free Christopher Tapp, at least partway. By 2017, the pressure that Carol Dodge and Tapp's legal team had been building for years finally cracked the case open, but only halfway. With the false confession evidence mounting, with national experts on record, and with the public increasingly aware that the DNA had never matched, prosecutors agreed to a deal. Tapp's rape conviction was thrown out entirely. His murder sentence was reduced to the time he had already served, and in March of 2017, after 20 years behind bars, Christopher Tapp walked out of prison. It should have been pure triumph. It wasn't, and here's why. Under the terms of that deal, Tapp was still technically considered guilty of the murder. He was free, but not cleared. He carried the conviction with him, a stain that said he had killed Angie Dodge, even as everyone closest to the evidence understood he hadn't. There was a striking image from that day. Among the first people Christopher Tapp embraced as a free man was Carol Dodge, the mother of the girl he'd been convicted of killing, the woman who had once wanted him dead, and who had then spent years fighting to get him out. She had taken the stand in support of him. Two people bound together by the same tragedy, on the same side at last. But freedom for Tapp did not answer the central question. If he didn't kill Angie Dodge, and he didn't, then who did? The real murderer was still out there, had been out there the entire time, unpunished and unnamed. To find him, this case needed the one thing it had never had, a way to put a name to the DNA. That way had just been invented. For more than 2 decades, the killer's DNA had sat in evidence with nowhere to go. The standard tool was CODIS, the FBI's National Criminal DNA Database. Run a crime scene sample against it, and if your suspect has been arrested and entered into the system, you get a match. But Angie Dodge's killer had never been entered into CODIS for anything that would land him there. So year after year, the most damning evidence in the case, his own genetic code, matched no one. Then came the breakthrough that changed cold cases everywhere: forensic genetic genealogy. It had just been used, in 2018, to identify the Golden State Killer after decades, and it set off a wave across the country. The method flips the entire approach. Instead of looking for the killer directly, you look for his family. You take the crime scene DNA and build a detailed genetic profile, then upload it to public genealogy databases where ordinary people have submitted their own DNA to trace ancestry. The search returns partial matches, distant cousins, shared ancestors. From there, genealogists build a family tree and work inward, generation by generation, until the branches narrow to a single living person who fits. In late 2018, Idaho Falls investigators brought in one of the leading figures in this new field, C.C. Moore, working with the company Parabon Nanolabs, and uploaded the killer's profile to a public database. The matches pointed to descendants of one particular couple. More identified 6 male descendants who could fit. Investigators zeroed in on one who had been in Idaho in 1996 and tested him. He didn't match. It would have been easy to stop there. They didn't. Moore kept building the tree for another 3 months, until she found a 7th descendant of that same family, a man no one had been looking at, whose name had never come up in 23 years of investigation. His name was Brian Lee Drips. When investigators looked into Brian Drips, the truth landed like a hammer. In 1996, at the time Angie Dodge was murdered, Brian Drips had been living directly across the street from her. Not in another town, not in another state, across the street. And it got worse. 5 days after the murder, during the routine neighborhood canvass, when police went door to door asking residents what they'd seen, Drips had been interviewed. He had stood there, answered their questions, and been let go. He was the killer, and he had been within arm's reach of the investigation in its very first week, not long after he moved away. By 2019, Drips was living in Caldwell, Idaho. Investigators didn't approach him directly. They did what good detectives do once genealogy points the way. They watched him, and they waited for him to leave behind a piece of himself. He did, a cigarette butt, tossed from his car window. They collected it, and they tested the DNA against the sample preserved from Angie's apartment 23 years earlier. It was a complete match. On May 15, 2019, Brian Drips was arrested, and under questioning, he confessed. He told investigators he had been drunk and high on cocaine that night, that he broke into Angie's apartment while she slept, and that he had gone there intending to rape her. When she fought back, he killed her. He said he had acted alone, and he confirmed the detail that demolished the entire original case. He did not know Christopher Tapp. The 2 men had never been connected at all. The accomplices, the theory of multiple attackers, the whole structure built on Tapp's coerced confession. None of it had ever been real. One man, across the street, the entire time. With the real killer in custody and confessed, the last piece of injustice could finally be undone. On July 17, 2019, 2 months after Drips's arrest, Christopher Tapp stood in an Idaho courtroom, and his murder conviction was vacated in full. He was not just free now, he was innocent, officially and completely. The judge told him plainly that as far as the court was concerned, he was cleared of the charges he had lived under for more than 20 years. It was a landmark moment, and not only for Tapp. It is widely recognized as the first time forensic genetic genealogy was used to exonerate a wrongly convicted person. The same science that had been catching killers was now, for the first time, proving an innocent man innocent. The technology cut both ways. It could close a cell door on the guilty and open one for the wrongly condemned. Tapp spoke about being given a second chance at a life he had largely lost, 20 years gone for something he never did. And once again, Carol Dodge was there. The mother who had once wanted him executed had become the engine of his exoneration. Their embrace, captured that day, is one of the most remarkable images in the history of American wrongful convictions. A grieving mother and a freed man, both robbed by the same crime, standing together because she refused to stop asking who really killed her daughter. But there was still a sentence to be handed down. The man who had caused all of it had yet to answer for any of it. In February of 2021, Brian Drips pleaded guilty to the first-degree rape and murder of Angie Dodge. On June 8, 2021, nearly 25 years after that morning in 1996, he stood for sentencing in a Bonneville County courtroom. He was 55 years old. The judge sentenced him to a minimum of 20 years before any possibility of parole, up to life in prison. Given his failing health, his own attorneys acknowledged he would almost certainly die behind bars. The sentencing hearing was where the families finally got to speak. Angie's brother Todd described what the murder had done. Chaos, he called it. Chaos for a lifetime. An atomic bomb dropped in the center of their family and their community. He counted the days he had carried it, more than 9,000. And in an act of extraordinary grace, he insisted that Christopher Tapp be recognized as a victim of Drips too, that the innocent man's stolen 20 years belonged on the list of damage this one man had caused. Carol Dodge faced her daughter's killer directly. She told him about the last words she ever spoke to Angie, that she loved her, and about holding her daughter for the final time. And then she told him she could not forgive him, that he had shattered their family. The judge, for his part, said what everyone in the room already knew, that it was impossible to measure this much damage. A young woman dead, an innocent man imprisoned for 2 decades, 2 families broken, and one man who had lived 23 ordinary years while all of it unfolded. The end of the case did not give anyone their years back, but it did change things. For Christopher Tapp, and beyond him. After his exoneration, Tapp did not disappear into bitterness. He became an advocate, pushing lawmakers in Idaho and elsewhere to properly compensate people who had been wrongfully convicted. People who, like him, walked out of prison after decades with no job, no home, no support, and a system that had taken everything and offered nothing back. Idaho passed a compensation law, and Tapp received compensation under it, along with a multi-million-dollar settlement from the city whose investigation had put him away. It could not return what was taken. But it was an acknowledgement, in the bluntest terms a system can offer, that he had been wronged. And the case left a larger mark on the law itself. Angie Dodge's murder became one of the defining examples of 2 things at once: how a false confession can send an innocent person to prison even when the physical evidence screams otherwise, and how forensic genetic genealogy can correct that, not only by catching the guilty, but by freeing the innocent. Every wrongful conviction case that uses this science going forward stands on the ground this one helped break. That is the strange, double-edged legacy here. The same fragile sample of DNA that sat untouched for 23 years did 2 jobs when the science finally caught up to it. It named the man who killed Angie Dodge, and it cleared the man who never should have been blamed. If there's a lesson to carry out of Angie Dodge's story, it's this: a confession is not the same as the truth. For 20 years, this case stood on the words of a frightened 20-year-old who told police what they pressed him to say. Those words felt like certainty. They felt like a closed case. But certainty isn't evidence, and a confession can be manufactured. The only thing in this entire case that never lied, never bent, and never changed was the DNA. And for 2 decades, no one had the tools to read what it was saying. When they finally did, it spoke clearly. It said the man in the cell was innocent, and it said the man across the street was guilty. Both had been true the entire time. It just took 23 years and a brand new science to prove it. Angie Dodge was 18 years old, with her own apartment and her whole life in front of her. She deserved justice that was not just swift, but right. And in the end, after far too long, she got it. So did the innocent man who paid for her killer's crime. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe the truth is worth the wait, subscribe. There's always another case that refused to stay cold.